The drill instructor's voice cut through the morning air like a blade as he stood over the petite figure struggling with the obstacle course. "Clark, you're embarrassing yourself and this course. Maybe it's time you considered a different career path." 22-year-old Ember Clark pulled herself to her feet, dirt streaking her pale European features, her auburn hair escaping from its regulation bun. At 5 feet 1 inch and barely 110 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a Marine candidate. What Gunnery Sergeant Torres didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this seemingly fragile young woman had a classified service record that would make seasoned veterans question everything they thought they knew about warfare. Hidden in a locked file cabinet sat documentation of 423 confirmed kills, earned in classified operations across 3 continents before she'd even turned 20-1. Camp Pendleton's morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as Echo Company began their daily routine. The California base hummed with its familiar rhythm of shouted commands, pounding boots, and the distant crack of rifle fire from the ranges. For most of the recruits, this was their first taste of military life, but for Ember Clark, it felt like stepping backward in time. She stood in formation with the other candidates, her regulation uniform hanging slightly loose on her small frame. Born in Prague to a Czech mother and British father, Ember had inherited her mother's delicate bone structure and her father's stubborn determination. Her pale green eyes held a depth that her fellow recruits couldn't quite place, and when she spoke, her soft accent carried just a hint of her European origins. The other candidates towered over her. Jackson Miller, a former college football player from Texas, stood 6 feet 3 inches and looked like he'd been carved from granite. Sarah Rodriguez, an Olympic-level swimmer, possessed the kind of athletic build that screamed competence. Even Marcus Kim, the quiet computer science graduate, had 6 inches and 40 pounds on Ember. "Listen up, ladies and gentlemen," Gunnery Sergeant Torres announced, his weathered face scanning the formation. At 45, Torres had spent 27 years in the Corps, with deployment ribbons covering half his chest. His reputation for breaking down cocky recruits was legendary, but he prided himself on building them back up into Marines. "Today we're starting combat conditioning. This isn't high school gym class. This is about finding out who has what it takes to serve alongside real Marines in real combat situations." Ember kept her expression neutral as Torres's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than the others. She'd seen that look before, the mixture of skepticism and protective concern that instructors got when they thought someone was in over their head. It was the same look she'd received from her first handler in Minsk, from the SES liaison in Gibraltar, from the CIA operative in Prague who'd recruited her when she was barely 18. What none of them could see was the invisible weight she carried, the memories of rooftops in Sarajevo, of jungle clearings in Myanmar, of urban warfare in cities whose names never appeared in newspapers. At 22, Ember had more combat experience than most career soldiers would accumulate in 20 years. But her official Marine record showed nothing but her civilian background, language studies at Charles University, a brief stint as a translator for humanitarian organizations, and a surprisingly high score on the Marine aptitude tests. The morning's first exercise was the obstacle course, a brutal combination of rope climbs, wall traversals, and mud crawls designed to test both physical capability and mental resilience. Ember watched as her fellow candidates attacked the course with varying degrees of success. Miller powered through the rope climb using raw strength, while Rodriguez demonstrated textbook technique on the balance beams. When Ember's turn came, the whispers started immediately. "Poor girl," she heard someone mutter. "She's going to get destroyed out there." Another voice added, "I give her 2 weeks before she drops out." The course began with a 12-foot wall that required candidates to pull themselves up and over using upper body strength alone. Ember approached it with calm precision, her movements economical and efficient. where others relied on brute force. She used technique, finding the optimal grip points, leveraging her body weight, conserving energy for the challenges ahead. She cleared the wall smoothly, but Torres's voice boomed across the course. "Faster, Clark. Your enemy isn't going to wait for you to take your time." What he couldn't know was that Ember had scaled walls twice that height while carrying 50 pounds of equipment and evading hostile forces. This obstacle course, challenging as it was designed to be, felt almost leisurely by comparison. Rope climb came next, and here her smaller stature became apparent. While Miller hauled himself up through pure strength, Ember had to work harder, her muscles straining against gravity. She made it to the top, but her time was slower than the others, earning another sharp comment from Torres about meeting minimum standards. As she moved through each obstacle, the tire run, the low crawl under barbed wire, the balance beam, Ember maintained her pace but never dominated. She completed everything successfully, but without the flair or obvious competence that would have impressed the instructors. To watching eyes, she looked like someone working at the very edge of her capabilities, barely making the grade. What they didn't see was the deliberate restraint in her movements, the careful modulation of her performance. Ember had learned long ago that standing out could be dangerous, that sometimes survival meant appearing average while maintaining lethal competence beneath the surface. Her muscle memory wanted to demonstrate the fluid precision of someone who'd killed at distances most people couldn't accurately judge, but her tactical mind knew better. 3 weeks into training, the pattern had crystallized into something almost ritualistic. Every morning brought new challenges designed to separate the capable from the inadequate, and every morning Ember found herself categorized firmly in the latter group despite consistently meeting minimum standards. The marksmanship evaluation was particularly painful to endure. Ember stood at the firing line with her M16A4, the weapon feeling almost toy-like in her hands compared to the custom rifles she'd used in operations across 3 continents. The targets were set at 300 yards, a distance she could hit blindfolded, with a dozen different weapon systems. "Remember, Clark," Instructor Martinez called out as he walked behind the firing line. "Squeeze, don't pull. Let the rifle do the work." His tone carried the patient condescension reserved for struggling students who needed extra encouragement. Ember nodded appreciatively, as if grateful for the basic instruction, while internally calculating wind speed, humidity factors, and minute barrel adjustments that would have impressed Olympic-level marksmen. When the command to fire came, she deliberately scattered her shots around the target's outer rings, creating a pattern that suggested someone working hard but lacking natural aptitude. Her scorecard showed consistent marginal performance, never failing but never excelling. 23 out of 40 points, placing her in the bottom third of the class. Rodriguez shot a 36, Miller managed 32, and even Kim, despite his non-athletic background, scored 29. The instructors marked Ember's score with the kind of patient notation reserved for recruits they expected to improve slowly, if at all. What they couldn't see was the muscle memory screaming at her to adjust her stance, to control her breathing in the specific pattern that had allowed her to make impossible shots in impossible conditions. In Minsk, she'd eliminated a target at 800 meters in a crosswind while perched on an unstable fire escape. In Libya, she'd made 3 consecutive headshots at 600 meters, while enemy fire was actively targeting her position. The exclusion became most apparent during specialized training selections. When opportunities arose for advanced courses, sniper training, reconnaissance specialization, or combat leadership programs, Ember's name never appeared on the consideration lists. "Sorry, Clark," Gunnery Sergeant Torres explained after she'd inquired about the reconnaissance course. "Your scores are solid, but these programs are for our top performers. You're doing fine with the standard training track. Focus on mastering those fundamentals before you think about specialization." She watched as Rodriguez was selected for Advanced combat training, as Miller was recommended for heavy weapons specialization, as Kim was invited to join the Communications Intelligence program. Each selection was logical, based on their demonstrated strengths and consistent high performance. Meanwhile, Ember continued her secret preparation routine. Every night after lights out, she would review tactical scenarios in her mind, mentally, rehearsing movements and strategies that had kept her alive in actual combat. She maintained her physical conditioning through exercises designed to look like someone struggling to meet minimum standards while actually preserving the reflexes and muscle memory of an elite operative. Her personal gear, inspected weekly like all recruits, appeared regulation standard. But hidden in the lining of her kit bag were small items that told a different story. A fiber optic scope lens that could be attached to standard issue binoculars to enhance their range. Tactical maps of coastal California that she'd memorized, down to individual building layouts, and communication codes that she'd practiced until they were second nature. None of the instructors knew that. Ember spent her off-duty time studying satellite imagery of Camp Pendleton and the surrounding area. They didn't know that she'd identified 17 different infiltration routes onto the base, mapped every security checkpoint, and calculated response times for various emergency scenarios. To them, she appeared to be someone who spent her free time catching up on basic military knowledge that came naturally to others. The most telling moment came during a field exercise designed to test tactical thinking. The recruits were divided into fire teams and given a scenario: locate and neutralize a hostile position using available resources and terrain. It was exactly the kind of problem that Ember had solved dozens of times in real operations, often with much higher stakes and fewer resources. She watched as her team struggled with basic tactical concepts that were second nature to her. Miller wanted to use brute force and direct assault. Rodriguez suggested a flanking maneuver that would expose them to crossfire. Kim proposed a technological solution that would take too long to implement. Ember could see the optimal approach immediately: a combination of misdirection, elevation advantage, and timing that would allow them to complete the objective with minimal risk and maximum efficiency. But suggesting such a sophisticated strategy would raise questions she couldn't answer without blowing her cover. Instead, she offered minor suggestions that appeared to come from basic common sense rather than tactical expertise. "Maybe we should check the high ground first," she suggested hesitantly, as if the idea had just occurred to her. "And shouldn't someone watch our backs while we advance?" Her suggestions were noted, but not emphasized in the after-action review. The instructors praised the team's eventual success while noting areas for improvement, but none of the credit flowed to Ember's quietly provided insights. She remained invisible, a background player in scenarios where she could have been the decisive factor. The pattern extended beyond training exercises into daily military life. When volunteers were needed for challenging assignments, night patrols, equipment maintenance under pressure, leadership roles in training scenarios, Ember's name was never considered. She had become the reliable baseline, someone who could be counted on to meet minimum standards, but never to exceed them. The mess hall conversations that evening painted a clear picture of how Echo Company viewed their newest member. Ember sat at a corner table, picking at her regulation dinner while absorbing the discussions happening around her. She'd developed exceptional hearing during her years in the field, a survival skill that now served her in gathering intelligence on her fellow recruits' perceptions. "I mean, she's nice enough," Rodriguez was saying to a group at the neighboring table, "but this isn't about being nice. We're training to be Marines. People's lives are going to depend on us in combat situations." She lowered her voice slightly, but not enough to escape Ember's attention. "I'm just not sure someone that small should be here. It's not her fault, but physics is physics." Miller nodded in agreement, his massive frame making the mess hall chair look like children's furniture. "Back home in Texas, we'd call her pocket-sized," he said, not unkindly but with the casual dismissiveness of someone stating an obvious fact. She's tough for her size, I'll give her that. But when we're talking about carrying wounded Marines or hauling heavy equipment in combat zones..." He shrugged, letting the implication hang in the air. Kim, who'd been mostly quiet since arriving at Pendleton, finally spoke up. "Maybe size isn't everything." She completed the obstacle course. "Her academic scores are off the charts. I heard she speaks 6 languages fluently. That's got to count for something in modern warfare." "Languages are great for embassy duty," Rodriguez replied. "But when someone's shooting at you, you need someone who can shoot back effectively and carry their weight literally, not just figuratively." The conversation continued, but Ember had heard enough. She finished her meal in silence, her expression neutral despite the familiar sting of being underestimated. These were good people, she could tell that much. Their concerns weren't born from malice but from genuine worry about unit effectiveness and battlefield survival. They were thinking like Marines should think, prioritizing mission success and team safety over individual feelings. What they couldn't know was that Ember had been carrying her weight in ways they couldn't imagine since she was 18 years old. The languages Kim had mentioned weren't just academic achievements. They were tools she'd use to infiltrate terrorist cells, to gather intelligence in hostile territories, to pose as everything from an aid worker to an arms dealer depending on mission requirements. Her small stature, which seemed like such a limitation to her fellow candidates, had been her greatest asset in operations where blending in meant survival. In Chechnya, she'd posed as a displaced refugee to get close to a war criminal. In Afghanistan, her appearance had allowed her to move through areas where a larger, more obviously military presence would have been detected immediately. The 423 confirmed kills that sat in her classified file weren't the result of brute force or physical dominance. They were precision shots taken at extreme distances, close quarters eliminations performed in complete silence, and strategic eliminations that had prevented larger conflicts from erupting. Each number represented not just a life taken, but often dozens or hundreds of lives saved through the prevention of terrorist attacks or the elimination of high-value targets. But here at Camp Pendleton, none of that mattered. Here, she was just Ember Clark, the too small candidate who struggled with the rope climb and looked like she might break under the weight of a full pack. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was probably the most combat-experienced person on the entire base. But her cover story required her to appear as green as the rest of the recruits. The following morning brought hand-to-hand combat training, and Ember knew this would be particularly challenging to navigate. Gunnery Sergeant Torres paired them off for basic defensive maneuvers, and she found herself facing Miller, who outweighed her by more than 100 pounds. "Take it easy on her, Miller," Torres called out, his tone carrying both instruction and subtle mockery. "Let's see if our academic star can handle some basic defensive positions." Miller nodded seriously, clearly uncomfortable with the mismatch. "I'll go slow," he assured Ember quietly. "Just try to get a feel for the movements." Ember appreciated his consideration, but it stung nonetheless. In reality, she could have incapacitated Miller in at least 12 different ways before he'd fully processed her initial movement. Her training in Krav Maga, Systema, and various other martial arts disciplines had been honed through actual life-or-death encounters, not gymnasium practice sessions. Instead, she allowed Miller to demonstrate the basic throws and holds, playing the role of the struggling novice learning fundamental techniques. When it was her turn to attempt the moves, she deliberately fumbled them, showing just enough competence to avoid complete humiliation, but never enough to suggest real capability. "Better, Clark," Torres commented, though his tone suggested he was being generous. "Keep practicing those basics." In combat, technique can sometimes overcome size disadvantages, but only if you perfect the fundamentals. The other recruits watched these exchanges with expressions ranging from sympathy to quiet relief that they weren't in her position. Ember recognized the dynamic. She was becoming the unofficial baseline, the person everyone else could feel confident about exceeding. It was a role she'd played before in different contexts, and while it served her cover, it grated against every instinct she'd developed as an elite operative. As the days continued, the pattern solidified. Ember performed adequately but never excellently. She completed every requirement, but always seemed to be working at her maximum capacity to do so. The other recruits began treating her with a mixture of protective concern and gentle condescension, while the instructors viewed her as someone who might make it through training but would likely be assigned to support roles rather than front-line combat positions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The tension in the briefing room was palpable as Major Harrison spread the satellite photographs across the table. Echo Company's most advanced trainees sat at attention, their expressions serious as they processed the gravity of what they were seeing. It was week 8 of training, and this exercise would determine who among them was ready for the Marine Corps' most demanding programs. "Gentlemen and ladies," Harrison began, his scarred hands pointing to key locations on the aerial images. "This is Operation Red Dawn. It's a simulated hostage rescue scenario, but I want you to treat it as if lives actually depend on your performance. Because someday they will." The photos showed a mock compound built in the hills 20 miles east of Camp Pendleton. 3 buildings arranged in a defensive triangle, surrounded by rough terrain that offered both challenges and opportunities for approaching forces. Intelligence reports indicated that hostages were being held in the central structure, with hostile forces positioned throughout the complex. Ember studied the images from her position near the back of the room, her trained eye immediately identifying details that others might miss. The compound's layout was similar to facilities she'd infiltrated in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. She could see the sight lines, the weak points in the perimeter, the optimal approach routes that would minimize exposure while maximizing tactical advantage. "This operation requires our absolute best," Harrison continued. "We're selecting 12 candidates for the assault team, 4 for overwatch and sniper support, and 6 for logistics and communications. The rest will observe and learn." The selection process began immediately. Harrison called names based on performance records, tactical aptitude scores, and instructor recommendations. Rodriguez was selected for the assault team, her athletic ability and improving marksmanship making her an obvious choice. Miller's name was called for the logistics role. His size and strength, ideal for equipment transport. Kim surprised everyone by being selected for communication support, his technical background finally finding its place in military operations. One by one, the top performers were assigned their roles. Each selection met with nods of approval from the assembled instructors. Ember waited, knowing what was coming but hoping against logic that her name might be called. Her performance scores, while adequate, placed her in the middle tier of candidates. More importantly, her perceived limitations made her an unlikely choice for any role that required physical capability or tactical sophistication. "Clark," Harrison's voice finally cut through her thoughts. "You're assigned to equipment inventory and post-exercise documentation. Make sure all gear is accounted for when the teams return." The familiar sting of exclusion hit her, but Ember nodded professionally. Around her, the selected candidates exchanged excited glances and began immediate discussions about strategy and coordination. She was once again relegated to the support role, the person who counted equipment while others engaged in the meaningful work. But as she listened to their planning discussions, Ember felt a growing sense of unease. The approach they were developing was sound but predictable, following textbook procedures that would work against novice opponents but might struggle against experienced resistance. Their timeline was conservative, their backup plans limited, and their intelligence analysis was surface level. The compound has 3 entry points, Rodriguez was explaining to her assault team. We take the main entrance with overwhelming force while the Overwatch team provides cover from the southern ridge. Ember could see immediately that the southern ridge was the obvious choice, which made it the worst choice against any competent defender. The northern approach offered better concealment and a superior angle of fire, but it required technical climbing skills and intimate knowledge of the terrain's acoustic properties. She wanted to speak up, to share the insights that came from years of actual operational experience, but her role in the exercise was clear. She was there to count ammunition and document equipment usage, not to contribute to tactical planning. The briefing continued for another hour, with instructors providing additional intelligence and refining the mission parameters. The operation would begin at 06:00 the following morning, with teams deploying under simulated combat conditions. Success would be measured by speed of completion, minimal casualties among the assault force, and successful extraction of all hostages. As the meeting dispersed, Ember lingered to study the compound photographs one more time. Her photographic memory absorbed every detail, the spacing between buildings, the elevation changes around the perimeter, the vegetation patterns that could provide concealment or reveal movement. What she saw troubled her. The compound's design wasn't random. It showed signs of sophisticated defensive planning that suggested the opposing force would be more competent than typical training scenarios. The building placement created interlocking fields of fire. The terrain channeled approaching forces into predetermined kill zones, and the escape routes were limited and predictable. Studying hard, Clark. Gunnery Sergeant Torres had approached without her noticing, his voice carrying its usual mixture of encouragement and low expectations. Just trying to understand the layout, Sergeant, Ember replied, careful to sound like someone doing due diligence rather than someone conducting professional threat assessment. Good attitude, Torres nodded approvingly. Understanding the big picture makes you better at your assigned role. Just remember, your job is equipment accountability, not tactical analysis. Leave the complex thinking to the people trained for it. The dismissal was gentle but clear. Ember was being reminded of her place in the hierarchy, her role as support personnel rather than operational decision-maker. She acknowledged the instruction and gathered her materials, but her mind was already working through scenarios that the selected teams hadn't considered. That evening, she sat in her quarters reviewing the mission timeline while her fellow recruits celebrated their selections. Through the thin walls, she could hear Rodriguez discussing equipment loadouts with her team, Miller coordinating supply logistics, and Kim testing communication protocols. None of them were discussing the possibility that their approach might be anticipated, that their obvious tactical choices might be exactly what their opponents were prepared to counter. They were thinking like students in a training exercise rather than operators facing a real threat. Ember pulled out her notebook and began sketching alternative approaches, not because she expected to use them, but because the analytical process helped her process the tactical situation. As she worked, a growing certainty settled in her mind. Tomorrow's operation was going to encounter problems that the selected teams weren't prepared to handle. The evening before Operation Red Dawn, Ember found herself in the equipment bay, conducting her assigned pre-mission inventory. The sterile smell of gun oil and canvas filled the air as she methodically checked each piece of gear against her master list, ensuring that every rifle, every radio, every piece of tactical equipment was accounted for and ready for deployment. Her position near the storage racks placed her within earshot of the final planning session taking place in the adjacent briefing room. The walls were thin enough that voices carried, and her enhanced hearing, developed through years of gathering intelligence in hostile environments, allowed her to follow the conversation even when the speakers thought they were speaking privately. "I still think we should have Clark doing something more active," Kim was saying, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone questioning authority but trying to be respectful. She completed sniper familiarization with decent scores, and her situational awareness during field exercises has been solid. Rodriguez's response was immediate and dismissive. Kim, be realistic. Tomorrow we're going up against experienced opposition in challenging terrain. This isn't about being nice or inclusive. It's about mission success and keeping everyone alive. But she's consistently met every requirement, Kim pressed. Maybe not at the top of the class, but she's never failed anything. Miller's deeper voice cut through the discussion with the authority of someone stating obvious facts. Meeting minimum requirements doesn't qualify someone for specialized operations. Tomorrow we need people who can carry wounded teammates, scale obstacles under fire, and make split-second tactical decisions. No offense to Clark, but physics doesn't care about meeting requirements. Ember continued her inventory, her hand steady as she checked ammunition counts, but her jaw tightened slightly as the conversation continued. The irony was almost unbearable. These recruits, well-meaning as they were discussing her capabilities, while she stood meters away with more operational experience than their instructors combined. "Look, I like Clark," Rodriguez continued, her tone taking on the patient explanation of someone educating a naive colleague. "She's smart, she works hard, and she's got heart. But when someone's shooting at you for real, you want backup you can count on physically, not just intellectually. If I go down tomorrow, I need someone who can drag me to safety, not someone who can discuss the tactical implications of my situation." The planning continued, but the conversation had shifted to operational details. Ember heard them discussing approach routes, timing sequences, and contingency plans. Their strategy was solid but conventional, exactly what she would have expected from well-trained recruits following established doctrine. What troubled her wasn't their tactical choices. Those were reasonable given their training level. What troubled her was how easily they'd dismissed the possibility that someone like her might contribute to the mission's success. They were thinking in terms of physical capability and training scores, unable to conceive of experience or skills that didn't fit their narrow definitions of military competence. After the planning session ended, and the participants dispersed to their quarters, Ember finished her inventory and submitted her report. Everything was accounted for, every piece of equipment ready for the morning's operation. She'd done her job exactly as assigned, just as she'd been doing for 8 weeks. But as she walked back to her quarters, Ember's mind was working through scenarios that extended far beyond equipment accountability. The compound layout, the opposing force capabilities, the terrain challenges, all of it pointed toward complications that tomorrow's operation wasn't prepared to handle. In her quarters, she opened her personal notebook and began detailed analysis of the intelligence they'd been provided. Her years of operational experience had taught her to look for what wasn't being said, to identify the gaps in information that might indicate deliberate misdirection or incomplete intelligence. The compound photograph showed a sophisticated defensive setup that suggested their opponents weren't typical role players. The building placement, the terrain modifications, the visible security measures, all of it indicated that tomorrow's exercise would be more challenging than the recruits expected. More troubling was what she didn't see in the intelligence package. No detailed information about the opposing force's capabilities, no analysis of their likely defensive strategies, no contingency planning for scenarios where the standard approach might fail. The mission briefing had focused on execution of a predetermined plan rather than adaptive response to changing conditions. Ember had encountered similar situations in actual operations, where initial intelligence proved incomplete or deliberately misleading. The difference was that in her previous missions, failure meant death rather than poor training scores. Tomorrow's operation would test whether Echo Company's best recruits could adapt when their prepared strategies met unexpected resistance. She closed her notebook and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would likely reveal gaps in the selected team's preparation that their instructors hadn't anticipated. The question wasn't whether complications would arise. Experienced defenders always found ways to disrupt attackers' plans. The question was whether the assault team would recognize when their approach wasn't working and adapt accordingly. As she lay in her bunk listening to the base's nighttime sounds, Ember found herself hoping that her concerns were unfounded, that tomorrow's operation would proceed smoothly and successfully. But her operational instincts, honed through years of real combat, suggested otherwise. The tactical situation reminded her too much of operations where she'd had to adapt rapidly to unexpected resistance, where predetermined plans had to be abandoned in favor of improvised solutions. Tomorrow's exercise was designed to test the recruits' capabilities, but Ember suspected it would test them in ways they weren't expecting. The weeks following the Operation Red Dawn briefing brought subtle but unmistakable changes in how Ember's instructors and fellow recruits viewed her role within Echo Company. What had begun as gentle encouragement to focus on her strengths gradually shifted into something approaching suspicion about her motivations and attention to detail. It started with Gunnery Sergeant Torres questioning her equipment reports with unusual scrutiny. Ember had always been meticulous in her inventory work, a habit developed through years of operations where missing gear could mean mission failure or death. But her thoroughness, once appreciated as diligence, began to draw unwanted attention. "Clark, you're reporting discrepancies in ammunition counts that our previous inventories didn't catch," Torres said during a routine briefing, his tone carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. "Are you suggesting that our standard procedures are inadequate?" Ember had discovered that several ammunition lots were missing rounds that should have been accounted for in previous counts. In her operational experience, such discrepancies often indicated security breaches or unauthorized access. But here, her discovery was being treated as criticism of established procedures rather than valuable security intelligence. "No, Sergeant," she replied carefully. "I'm just reporting what I found during my counts. Perhaps the previous discrepancies were minor enough to fall within acceptable margins of error." Torres studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "In the future, Clark, focus on meeting standard reporting requirements rather than trying to revolutionize our inventory system. We've been doing this successfully for years before you arrived." The message was clear. Her attention to detail was exceeding expectations in ways that made her supervisors uncomfortable. She was supposed to be competent, but not exceptional. Reliable, but not innovative. Her thorough approach to assigned duties was being interpreted as overreach rather than excellence. The pattern extended to other aspects of her training. During tactical discussions, when Ember offered observations about terrain or strategic considerations, her comments were increasingly met with polite dismissal rather than thoughtful consideration. "Clark, you're overthinking this, Instructor," Martinez told her after she'd suggested that a proposed patrol route might be vulnerable to ambush at a specific choke point. "Sometimes the direct approach is the best approach. Save the complex analysis for the staff officers." What Martinez couldn't know was that Ember had actually been ambushed at that exact type of terrain feature in Bosnia, had lost team members to predictable tactical mistakes that careful route planning could have avoided. Her suggestions weren't theoretical overthinking, they were lessons learned through bitter experience. The most troubling development came during a weapons maintenance session when Ember was observed conducting cleaning procedures that exceeded standard military specifications. She developed habits of equipment care that reflected the critical importance of weapon reliability in actual combat operations, where a malfunctioning rifle meant immediate death rather than poor training scores. "Clark, why are you field stripping the bolt assembly?" Corporal Johnson asked, his tone suggesting she was performing unauthorized modifications rather than thorough maintenance. "Standard cleaning procedures don't require that level of detail." Ember looked up from the M16A4 she'd been working on. realizing that her maintenance routine had automatically shifted into the extensive procedures she'd learned through special operations training. In the field, this level of care had kept her weapons functioning in extreme conditions that would have disabled standard maintained equipment. "I thought it would be good to understand the weapon system completely," she replied, trying to sound like an enthusiastic recruit rather than someone with extensive firearms expertise. Johnson's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Enthusiasm is good, Clark, but follow established procedures. We don't need recruits improvising on weapon maintenance protocols." The incident was reported to Torres, who called Ember into his office the following day for what he termed a guidance session. She sat across from his desk while he reviewed her training file, his expression growing more concerned as he read. "Clark, you're developing a pattern that's troubling to me," Torres began, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "You're consistently exceeding the scope of your assigned duties, asking questions about operational matters outside your area of responsibility, and demonstrating knowledge that goes beyond what we've taught you here." Ember felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. "Sergeant, I'm just trying to be the best Marine I can be. I thought thoroughness and attention to detail were valued qualities." "They are, within appropriate boundaries," Torres replied. "But your version of thoroughness is starting to look like someone who's more interested in proving how much they know than in learning what they're being taught. That's a red flag for me." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Torres expressing concerns about Ember's focus and questioning whether she was approaching her training with the right mindset. His concerns weren't malicious, they reflected genuine worry about a recruit who seemed to be operating according to different standards than those being taught. What he couldn't understand was that Ember's standards had been forged through operations, where anything less than perfection meant mission failure and loss of life. Her attention to detail, her tactical thinking, her equipment maintenance procedures, all of it reflected training and experience that far exceeded what Marine recruits were expected to possess. The session ended with Torres assigning Ember to PURI, remedial training in following standard procedures, and a recommendation that she focus on meeting established requirements rather than exceeding them. She left his office with the clear understanding that her competence was being viewed as a problem rather than an asset. That evening, she sat in her quarters reviewing the situation with growing frustration. For 8 weeks, she'd carefully modulated her performance to appear average while maintaining her operational edge. Now, even that restrained excellence was drawing suspicion and criticism from instructors who couldn't conceive of someone with her background operating in their environment. The irony was profound. She was being criticized for standards of competence that would be essential for the very missions these Marines would eventually face in actual combat operations. Her thoroughness, tactical thinking, and attention to detail weren't character flaws. They were survival skills that had kept her alive through operations that most of these instructors had never imagined. The irony was profound. She was being criticized for standards of competence that would be essential for the very missions these Marines would eventually face in actual combat operations. Her thoroughness, tactical thinking, and attention to detail weren't character flaws. They were survival skills that had kept her alive through operations that most of these instructors had never imagined. But maintaining her cover required accepting their criticism and modifying her behavior to meet their expectations of mediocrity. Tomorrow's Operation Red Dawn would test whether the selected team could handle unexpected challenges. But Ember was beginning to realize that the real test was whether she could continue to hide her capabilities while watching others struggle with problems she could easily solve. Major Harrison's office felt smaller than usual as Ember sat across from his imposing desk, the weight of accumulated concerns pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Outside the window, she could see Echo Company conducting their morning physical training, their voices carrying faintly through the glass. As they went through routines that had become second nature over the past 2 months, Harrison shuffled through her file, his weathered face creased with concentration, as he reviewed reports from multiple instructors. At 52, he'd spent 3 decades in the Marine Corps, with deployment ribbons spanning conflicts from Somalia to Afghanistan. His reputation for developing exceptional Marines was legendary, but so was his intolerance for recruits who didn't fit the established mold. "Specialist Clark," Harrison began, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for serious disciplinary discussions. "I've been reviewing your performance record, and I need to address some concerning patterns that have emerged over the past several weeks." Ember maintained perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral despite the anxiety building in her chest. She'd been through interrogations by hostile intelligence services, had faced down war criminals and terrorist leaders, but this conversation carried a different kind of danger, the threat of exposure that could unravel years of careful identity. "Construction. Your technical competence is undeniable," Harrison continued, consulting the reports spread before him. "Your equipment inventories are flawless, your academic scores are exceptional, and you meet every physical standard we've established. However, multiple instructors have expressed concerns about your scope of interest." The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. Ember had heard similar language before, in debriefings where intelligence handlers questioned whether operatives were maintaining appropriate operational boundaries. The implication was clear. She was suspected of operating outside her assigned parameters. "Sir, I don't understand what you mean by scope of interest," Ember replied, though she understood perfectly. Her cover identity required her to appear genuinely confused by criticism that would be obvious to someone with her background. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that had evaluated thousands of Marines over his career. "You're studying tactical scenarios that aren't part of your curriculum. You're asking questions about operational procedures that fall outside your assigned specialization. You're demonstrating equipment knowledge that exceeds what we've taught." "You hear." Each accusation was accurate, and each reflected habits that were impossible for Ember to completely suppress. Her operational training had ingrained certain patterns of behavior, situational awareness, tactical analysis, equipment familiarity that were as natural as breathing but apparently suspicious in a training environment. "Sir, I thought comprehensive understanding would make me a better Marine," she said, allowing a note of uncertainty to enter her voice. "I've been trying to learn everything I can about military operations." "That's admirable in theory, Clark, but problematic in practice," Harrison replied, his tone becoming more pointed. "Military effectiveness depends on specialization and defined roles. When recruits start operating outside their assigned parameters, it creates confusion and undermines unit cohesion." The conversation was moving in a direction that Ember recognized. From previous operations, the slow tightening of investigative pressure designed to force revelations or admissions. Harrison wasn't just expressing concerns. He was conducting a professional assessment of someone he suspected might be more. Then she appeared. "Your weapons maintenance procedures exceed standard specifications," he continued, reading from Torres's report. "Your tactical observations during exercises demonstrate knowledge that recruits shouldn't possess. Your equipment inventories identify discrepancies that our established procedures missed. These aren't the behaviors of a typical recruit, Clark." Ember felt the familiar tension of operating under scrutiny, the careful balance between maintaining cover and avoiding behaviors that would raise additional suspicions. Every response had to be calibrated to appear authentic while deflecting. Deeper investigation. "Sir, I may have been overzealous in my preparation," she admitted, crafting an explanation that acknowledged the concerns while providing a plausible alternative to the truth. "I've always been detail-oriented, and perhaps I've been applying civilian academic standards to military training inappropriately." Harrison studied her response, clearly weighing her explanation against his accumulated concerns. "Clark, I'm going to be direct with you. Your instructors are beginning to question whether you're here for the right reasons. Your pattern of behavior suggests someone who's more interested in gathering information than in learning to be a Marine." The accusation was closer to the truth than Ember could safely acknowledge, but it also revealed the fundamental limitation of Harrison's perspective. He couldn't conceive of someone with legitimate advanced training choosing to repeat basic instruction, couldn't imagine motivations that extended beyond the obvious explanations for her presence. "Sir, I'm here because I want to serve my country." "As a Marine," she replied, allowing genuine emotion to enter her voice. "If my approach has been inappropriate, I'm willing to modify my behavior to meet your expectations." Harrison made notes on her file before looking up again. "Here's what's going to happen, Clark. You're going to focus exclusively on your assigned duties and curriculum. No more tactical analysis beyond what we're teaching you. No more equipment procedures beyond standard specifications. No more questions about operational matters outside your specialization." The restrictions were clear and comprehensive, designed to constrain exactly the behaviors that made Ember effective as an operative. She was being ordered to deliberately limit her competence to avoid appearing too knowledgeable for her supposed background. "I understand, sir," she replied, though compliance would require constant, conscious effort to suppress instincts that had kept her alive through years of dangerous operations. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "you're being reassigned from equipment inventory to basic administrative duties. File organization, training schedule coordination, routine paperwork. Tasks that will keep you focused on following established procedures rather than developing unauthorized initiatives." The reassignment was clearly punitive, designed to redirect her energy away from activities that had raised suspicions. But it also represented a significant reduction in her access to operational information and equipment that might prove crucial if situations developed beyond normal training parameters. "Yes, sir. When does the reassignment take effect?" "Immediately after tomorrow's Operation Red Dawn exercise," Harrison replied. "You'll complete your current inventory responsibilities, then transition to administrative support. Consider this an opportunity to demonstrate that you can operate within appropriate boundaries." Ember left Harrison's office with clear understanding that her cover identity was under increasing scrutiny, and that her continued presence at Camp Pendleton depended on convincing her superiors that she was nothing more than an overeager recruit who needed guidance rather than investigation. The challenge was maintaining that illusion while knowing that tomorrow's exercise would likely create situations where her advanced capabilities might become essential for mission success and personnel safety. The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Camp Pendleton at 0347 hours, its urgent wailing cutting through the barracks like a blade through silk. Ember jolted awake instantly, her operational reflexes engaging before her conscious mind fully processed the sound. Around her, other recruits stirred more slowly, groaning about the early hour and assuming it was another unscheduled drill. But Ember recognized something in the klaxon's rhythm that the others missed. This wasn't the standard training alert. The pattern was different, more urgent, carrying the distinctive urgency of an actual emergency rather than a planned exercise. She dressed quickly and moved toward the command center, her steps purposeful but not hurried enough to draw attention. The base was coming alive around her, with personnel emerging from buildings and vehicles, moving with the controlled urgency that indicated real problems rather than training scenarios. The command center was chaos when she arrived, with multiple radio conversations overlapping and officers moving between stations with grim expressions. Through the noise, she began piecing together fragments of information that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Lost contact at 0330 hours. Double quotes. Weather window closing rapidly. Last transmission indicated they were under heavy Fire. Major Harrison stood at the center of the activity, his face grave as he coordinated response efforts. The large tactical display showed a red dot blinking in the hills east of the base, the same location where Operation Red Dawn was scheduled to begin in 3 hours. Ember moved closer, using her assigned administrative duties as cover for gathering intelligence on the developing situation. What she learned made her blood run cold. The advance team that had deployed to establish the exercise parameters had encountered actual hostile forces at the mock compound. "Sir, we've confirmed multiple casualties," Captain Williams reported. To Harrison, his voice tight with stress. The opposition force wasn't simulated. Someone's occupied that compound with real weapons and real intent to engage. Harrison's response was immediate and professional. "Cancel Operation Red Dawn. Get our people out of there." "What's our current tactical situation?" 3 Marines wounded, 2 missing, Williams replied, consulting his notes. The advance team managed to establish a defensive perimeter, but they're pinned down by superior numbers and firepower. Weather's deteriorating rapidly. We'll lose helicopter support within 2 hours. Ember felt her operational instincts engaging as she processed the tactical situation. The compound she'd studied for weeks, the terrain she'd memorized, the defensive positions she'd analyzed, all of it was now the site of an actual firefight with Marines trapped and under fire. "What about ground extraction?" Harrison asked, already knowing the answer but needing confirmation. "Negative, sir. The road access is completely exposed, and satellite imagery shows hostile positions covering all approaches. Any ground convoy would be destroyed before reaching the perimeter." The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with limited options and time pressure that made conventional rescue approaches impossible. Ember recognized the scenario from her own operational experience: isolated friendly forces, superior enemy numbers, terrain that favored defenders, and weather conditions that limited support options. "Sir," Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio chatter. She was part of the original Operation Red Dawn team and had been monitoring the emergency from the briefing room. "Request permission to deploy with full assault team. We can reach the compound and extract our people." Harrison's response was swift and decisive. "Negative. I'm not sending more Marines into a situation we don't understand. We wait for additional intelligence and proper support." But Ember could see the tactical reality that others were missing. The wounded Marines needed immediate medical attention, and waiting for conventional support would mean waiting too long. The weather window was closing, the enemy was consolidating their positions, and every minute of delay reduced the chances of successful extraction. She stepped forward, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "Sir, I've studied that compound extensively. There are approach routes that could work." Harrison turned toward her, his expression shifting from intense focus to irritation. "Clark, this is not the time for unauthorized input. Return to your assigned duties." "Sir, with respect, I know that terrain better than anyone here," Ember pressed, knowing she was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "I've identified infiltration routes that could reach the trapped team without detection." The command center fell silent for a moment, with all eyes turning toward the small recruit who was volunteering for a mission that seasoned Marines were reluctant to attempt. Harrison's expression darkened as he processed what Ember was suggesting. "Specialist. Clark, you are a trainee assigned to administrative duties. You are not qualified for combat operations. You are not equipped for tactical missions. And you are specifically not authorized to participate in emergency response activities." The dismissal was absolute and final, but Ember could see the trapped Marines' positions on the tactical display, could visualize the terrain routes that would allow successful extraction, could calculate the timing and coordination necessary to save lives that were being lost while authorities debated appropriate procedures. "Sir, those Marines don't have time for proper authorization," she said, her voice carrying quiet conviction. Every minute we wait, their situation gets worse. Harrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Clark, you were just in my office yesterday being counseled about operating outside your assigned parameters. Now you're volunteering. For a combat mission you're not qualified to attempt. Stand down, immediately. Around them, the radio chatter continued with updates from the trap team. Medical supplies were running low, ammunition was being rationed, and enemy forces were conducting probing attacks that suggested a major assault was being prepared. Ember looked at the tactical display one more time, seeing not just positions and terrain features but actual people whose lives hung in the balance. Marines who had trained alongside her, who had dismissed her capabilities but didn't deserve to die because conventional rescue approaches were inadequate for the tactical situation. She turned away from Harrison and walked toward the exit, her expression neutral but her mind already shifting into operational mode. Behind her, the planning continued with focus on conventional approaches that would take hours to organize and might arrive too late to matter. But Ember had spent years conducting exactly these types of extractions, had developed techniques for reaching isolated personnel when standard procedures were insufficient. The question wasn't whether she could reach the trapped Marines. The question was whether she could do it without revealing capabilities that would expose her true identity and compromise missions that extended far beyond Camp Pendleton. The command center had settled into the grim rhythm of crisis management as dawn broke over Camp Pendleton. Updates from the trapped advance team came in 15-minute intervals, each report painting a progressively darker picture of their tactical situation. 3 Marines confirmed wounded, ammunition running critically low, and enemy forces showing increasing coordination and sophisticated equipment. Ember stood at her assigned administrative station, ostensibly organizing training schedules, while actually monitoring every radio transmission and tactical update. Her operational experience allowed her to read between the lines of the official reports, to understand the deteriorating situation in ways that the command staff might be missing. The latest update had been particularly troubling. Enemy forces were using military-grade equipment and demonstrating tactical knowledge that suggested professional training rather than opportunistic criminals. This wasn't a random encounter, it was a deliberate engagement by organized hostiles who had specifically chosen the exercise compound as their base of operations. Major Harrison paced between radio stations, his stress evident in the tight lines around his eyes. 3 hours into the crisis, his options remained limited by weather conditions, terrain challenges, and the unknown capabilities of the opposing force. Sir, Captain Williams approached with the latest intelligence summary. Satellite imagery confirms at least 12 hostiles in defensive positions around the compound. They've established interlocking fields of fire that cover all conventional approach routes. Harrison studied the satellite photos, his expression growing grimmer as he processed the tactical implications. What about the helicopter extraction? Weathers deteriorating faster than predicted, Williams replied. Flight operations are suspended indefinitely. Even if conditions improve, landing under fire in that terrain would be extremely hazardous. Ember could remain silent no longer. The tactical situation was exactly the type of scenario she'd handled dozens of times in her operational career, and the conventional approaches being discussed would either fail or arrive too late to save the trapped Marines. She approached Harrison's position, her voice respectful but urgent. Sir, request permission to present an alternative extraction plan. Harrison's response was immediate and sharp. Clark, I thought we had this conversation. You are not qualified to participate in tactical planning for combat operations. Sir, I understand the limitations of my official qualifications, Ember replied, choosing her words carefully. But I've conducted extensive analysis of that compound and the surrounding terrain. I believe there's an approach route that could work. The conversation drew attention from other officers in the command center, who turned to observe the unusual spectacle of a trainee offering tactical advice during an active crisis. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to outright skepticism. "Let me be clear, Specialist Clark," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of command and the frustration of mounting pressure. "You are suggesting that you, a recruit who's been here for 8 weeks, have identified tactical solutions that my experienced staff has missed." Ember recognized the impossible position she was putting herself in, but the alternative was watching Marines die while she possessed knowledge that could save them. "Sir, I'm not suggesting I'm more qualified than your staff. I'm suggesting that my detailed study of that specific terrain might provide information that could be useful." Colonel Richards, who had been monitoring the situation from the adjacent briefing room, stepped into the conversation. "Clark, explain what you think you know about this compound that our intelligence staff doesn't." The question was a test, and Ember knew that her response would determine whether she was taken seriously or immediately dismissed. She moved to the tactical display, pointing to specific terrain features that were barely visible in the satellite imagery. "Sir, the northern approach to the compound includes a dry creek bed that provides concealment for approximately 800 meters. The bed connects to a series of rocky outcroppings that offer cover and elevation advantage. From there, an infiltrator could reach the compound's blind spot and establish overwatch for extraction coordination." Richard studied the terrain features she was indicating, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest. That creek bed would be extremely difficult to navigate, especially under combat conditions. "Yes, sir, but it's also the one route that the enemy hasn't fortified because they consider it impassable," Ember replied. "Their defensive positions are oriented toward conventional approaches." Harrison interrupted the tactical discussion with visible frustration. "This is exactly the kind of inappropriate behavior I was talking about. Clark, you're not a tactical analyst, you're not a combat specialist, and you're not qualified to design extraction operations." The radio crackled with another update from the trap team. "Overwatch base, this is Alpha Team. Enemy forces are massing for coordinated assault. We need immediate extraction or reinforcement." The urgency in the transmission was unmistakable, and the tactical situation was rapidly approaching the point where any extraction attempt would become impossible. Ember could see the calculations playing out in Harrison's expression. Conventional approaches would take too long to organize. Helicopter support was unavailable, and his Marines were running out of time. "Sir," she pressed, knowing she was risking everything but unable to remain silent, "I volunteer to attempt the northern approach. I can reach the trap team and coordinate extraction from the blind spot." The command center fell silent, except for the steady chatter of radio communications. Every officer present turned to stare at the small recruit who was volunteering to attempt a mission that would challenge experienced special operations personnel. Harrison's response was swift and absolute. "Absolutely not. Clark, you are a trainee with 0 combat experience attempting to volunteer for a suicide mission. The answer is no. And if you continue to press this matter, you'll be placed under disciplinary confinement." "Sir, those Marines don't have time for conventional solutions," Ember replied, her voice steady despite the mounting tension. "Every minute we delay, those Marines have time for professional solutions implemented by qualified personnel." Harrison cut her off. "What they don't have time for is amateur rescue attempts by recruits who think they understand combat operations." "Colonel." Richards had been studying the satellite imagery while listening to the exchange. "Major Harrison, what's our current timeline for conventional extraction?" "Minimum 4 hours for ground assault preparation, assuming weather conditions improve for helicopter support," Harrison replied. "Possibly longer if the opposing force proves more capable than initial assessment suggested." Richards looked at the tactical display, then at the radio where updates from the trap team continued to paint an increasingly desperate picture. "And the trap team's ammunition status? Critical." They're rationing rounds and expect to be overrun within 2 hours, without resupply or extraction. The mathematics of the situation were clear to everyone in the command center. Conventional rescue would arrive too late to matter. But accepting an unauthorized extraction attempt by an unqualified trainee violated every protocol and precedent that governed military operations. Ember watched the calculations playing out in their expressions. Knowing that pride and procedure were preventing them from considering solutions that didn't fit established parameters. She'd encountered similar institutional thinking in previous operations, where authorities chose familiar failure over unfamiliar success. "Sir," she said quietly, "I understand your concerns about my qualifications. But those Marines are going to die unless someone attempts an unconventional approach." Harrison's final response was delivered with the finality of command authority. "Clark, you are dismissed from this operation and confined to quarters. That's an order." Ember sat on her bunk for exactly 7 minutes after being confined to quarters, using the time to finalize plans that had been forming in her mind since the crisis began. The mathematics of the situation were inescapable. The trapped Marines had perhaps 90 minutes before being overrun. Conventional rescue wouldn't arrive for at least 4 hours, and she possessed capabilities that could bridge that gap. The decision to act came with full understanding of the consequences. She would be court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, and quite possibly imprisoned for disobeying direct orders during a combat emergency. But she'd also lived through enough operations to know that some things mattered more than career consequences or institutional approval. Her escape from the barracks required skills that no Marine recruit should possess, but that had kept her alive through years of intelligence operations. The window in her quarters opened onto a maintenance corridor that she'd mapped during her first week at Pendleton, part of the situational awareness that had become second nature during her operational career. She moved through the base's infrastructure like a ghost, using service tunnels and maintenance areas that most personnel didn't know existed. Her route avoided checkpoints and high-traffic areas, keeping her invisible to the security systems that were focused on external threats rather than internal movement. The equipment she needed was stored in the advanced training facility, gear that was officially restricted to qualified personnel, but accessible to someone with her lock-picking skills and knowledge of base security protocols. She gathered a complete infiltration kit, tactical clothing and desert camouflage, a suppressed M4 carbine with specialized ammunition, communications equipment, medical supplies, and climbing gear. Each piece of equipment was selected for the specific challenges of the mission ahead. The suppressed rifle would allow her to eliminate sentries without alerting the main force. The climbing gear would enable movement through terrain that defenders considered impassable. The medical supplies would allow her to stabilize wounded Marines for extraction. As she prepared her equipment, Ember allowed herself a moment of bitter irony. For 8 weeks she'd been dismissed as too small and inexperienced for combat operations. Now she was conducting a solo infiltration mission that would challenge operators with decades of experience. The route to the compound took her through 20 miles of rugged terrain that she'd memorized during weeks of apparent over-preparation. What her instructors had seen as inappropriate curiosity had actually been tactical reconnaissance of the highest quality, preparation for exactly this type of contingency. She moved through the darkness with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years conducting similar operations in hostile territory. Every step was placed with consideration for noise discipline. Every pause calculated to avoid detection patterns that might alert distant observers. The compound came into view as dawn broke over the hills, and Ember's worst fears were confirmed. The opposing force wasn't random criminals or opportunistic insurgents. They were professional military personnel with sophisticated equipment and coordinated tactics. Their defensive positions showed the kind of planning that indicated advance, reconnaissance, and deliberate preparation. But their defenses were oriented toward conventional approaches, exactly as she'd predicted. The northern creek bed remained unguarded because they'd assessed it as impassable for infiltration purposes. They'd made the same mistake that authorities often made, assuming that difficult meant impossible. Ember entered the creek bed and began the most challenging movement of her career. The terrain was worse than satellite imagery had suggested, with loose rock that threatened to cascade at every step in vertical sections that required technical climbing skills. But it was also completely concealed from the compound's observation. Points. The infiltration took 3 hours of careful movement through terrain that would have challenged mountain climbing specialists. When she finally reached the compound's perimeter, Ember was positioned in the exact blind spot she'd identified, with clear sight lines to both the trapped Marine's position and the enemy. Defensive positions. Her first priority was establishing communication with the trapped team without alerting the opposing force. Using hand signals visible through their defensive positions' firing ports, she made contact with Sergeant Peterson, whose expression of shock almost compromised their operational security. Peterson's whispered radio transmission was barely audible. "Overwatch Base, this is Alpha Team. We have unexpected friendly contact in Overwatch position." Ember could hear the confusion in his voice, the inability to process how a Marine recruit had appeared in a position that special operations teams would have found challenging to reach. But she could also hear relief. Finally, someone had arrived who might be able to coordinate their extraction. The tactical situation was exactly as she'd assessed from the intelligence reports. 12 enemy personnel in prepared positions, sophisticated weapons and communications equipment, and coordination that suggested professional military training. But they'd made critical errors in their defensive planning that someone with her experience could exploit. Using suppressed fire, Ember began eliminating enemy personnel who were isolated from mutual support. Each shot was placed with surgical precision, targeting individuals whose removal would create gaps in the defensive perimeter without alerting other defenders to her presence. The enemy's response to their casualties was professional but predictable, following standard protocols that Ember had encountered in previous operations. They maintained their positions while attempting to identify the source of attacks, unaware that their hunter was positioned in terrain they'd considered impassable. Within 40 minutes, she'd reduced the opposing force by half and created a corridor that would allow helicopter extraction once the weather cleared. More importantly, she'd relieved pressure on the trapped Marines and bought time for conventional rescue forces to arrive. But as she prepared to signal for helicopter support, Ember realized that her unauthorized action had created consequences beyond the immediate tactical situation. Radio chatter from Camp Pendleton indicated that her absence had been discovered, that search teams were being organized, and that her extraction mission was being treated as a potential hostage situation. Major Harrison's voice crackled through emergency frequencies. "All units, be advised that Specialist Clark is missing from quarters and may be attempting unauthorized action at the crisis site. Locate and return immediately." Ember smiled grimly as she continued her Overwatch mission. In a few hours, when the trapped Marines were safely extracted and the tactical situation was resolved, she would face consequences that could end her military career. But she would also have proven that size, gender, and official qualifications were less important than capability, determination, and willingness to act when action was required. The helicopter that finally reached the compound 3 hours later carried more than just medical evacuation personnel. Major Harrison had insisted on personally overseeing the extraction, his expression grim as he processed the tactical situation. That defied every assumption he'd made about the crisis and the recruit who'd resolved it. Ember stood at the compound's main entrance as the aircraft settled onto the improvised landing zone, her uniform torn and stained with cordite residue, but her posture maintaining the military bearing that had never wavered throughout her unauthorized mission. The rescued Marines flanked her position, their expressions mixing gratitude with bewilderment at what they'd witnessed. Harrison emerged from the helicopter with a full investigation team, his face cycling through emotions that ranged from relief at the successful rescue to fury at the unprecedented breach of military discipline. The scene that greeted him challenged every framework he possessed for understanding combat operations and personnel capabilities. 6 enemy combatants lay dead in positions that demonstrated tactical precision and marksmanship skills that would have impressed special operations instructors. The compound had been cleared with efficiency that suggested extensive experience in close-quarters combat. Most impossibly, it had all been accomplished by the recruit he'd dismissed as unsuitable for tactical operations just hours earlier. Clark. Harrison's voice carried the controlled anger of a career officer whose fundamental assumptions had been shattered by undeniable evidence. You will explain to me immediately how a Marine trainee with 8 weeks of basic instruction conducted a solo infiltration mission against professional hostile forces. Ember maintained perfect attention as she responded, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Sir, I utilized tactics and techniques that I acquired prior to my enlistment in the Marine Corps. The answer was simultaneously completely truthful and utterly inadequate for explaining the tactical sophistication that Harrison had observed. Sergeant Peterson, who'd been closest to the action during Ember's assault on the compound, stepped forward to provide additional context. Sir, with respect, what Specialist Clark accomplished here was beyond anything I've seen in 15 years of Marine service, Peterson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed exceptional competence under extreme conditions. Her movement techniques, marksmanship, and tactical decision-making were professional level throughout the engagement. Harrison studied the compound layout while processing Peterson's assessment, trying to reconcile the evidence before him with his understanding of who Ember Clark was supposed to be. The tactical movement patterns, the precision of shot placement, the timing of engagements, all of it suggested someone with extensive special operations experience. Clark, your military record shows no prior service, no advanced training, and no background that would explain these capabilities, Harrison said, his tone shifting from anger toward something approaching investigative curiosity. Where exactly did you acquire the skills you demonstrated here? The question required an answer that Ember had been preparing for 8 weeks, knowing that maintaining her cover story indefinitely would be impossible if situations arose that demanded her actual capabilities. But providing a complete truthful response would compromise operations and personnel that extended far beyond Camp Pendleton. Sir, I received extensive tactical training through civilian programs that I pursued prior to enlistment, she replied, crafting an explanation that was technically accurate while concealing classified details. I believe that such preparation would make me a more effective Marine. Colonel Richards, who'd accompanied Harrison on the extraction mission, examined the enemy weapons and equipment with growing interest. His expression suggested someone processing intelligence that had implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. Clark, these hostile personnel were equipped with military-grade weapons and communications equipment, Richards observed, his tone carrying the professional interest of someone with intelligence background. Their tactical coordination suggested professional training. Defeating them required more than civilian shooting courses. The conversation was moving toward areas that Ember couldn't discuss without revealing information that would compromise ongoing operations and place other personnel at risk. But the evidence of her capabilities was too overwhelming to be explained through conventional background stories. Sir, I understand that my performance here raises questions about my background and qualifications, she said, choosing her words with the precision of someone navigating classified information protocols. I'm prepared to provide full briefings to appropriate authorities regarding my preparation and capabilities. Harrison and Richards exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that Ember Clark's presence at Camp Pendleton might involve considerations beyond standard recruit training. The tactical sophistication she demonstrated pointed toward backgrounds and training programs that were restricted to highly classified personnel. The rescued Marines provided additional testimony that painted a picture of someone operating at elite levels throughout the engagement. Their descriptions of her movement techniques, her tactical decision-making under pressure, and her marksmanship precision created a portrait of capabilities that belonged in special operations units, rather than basic training environments. "Sir," Rodriguez added, her earlier dismissal of Ember's capabilities replaced by professional respect for demonstrated competence. "Specialist Clark saved our lives using skills that most Marines never acquire." Whatever her background, she proved today that our initial assessments were completely wrong. As the evacuation proceeded and evidence was gathered for the inevitable investigation, Ember realized that her 8-week journey as an underestimated recruit was ending in exactly the way she'd hoped to avoid. Her capabilities were no longer hidden, her background would be scrutinized by intelligence professionals, and her continued presence at Camp Pendleton would require explanations that she wasn't authorized to provide, but she'd also accomplished something that mattered more than maintaining cover. She'd saved the lives of Marines who would have died if she'd allowed institutional thinking and protocol to override tactical necessity. The cost would be significant, but the alternative would have been unacceptable. Harrison's final words as they prepared for departure carried both recognition and warning. "Clark, this conversation is far from over. But first you're going to medical for evaluation, then to debriefing with people who have clearances appropriate for whatever you actually are." 6 months later, Ember stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been relegated to equipment inventories and dismissed suggestions. But everything about her position and role had transformed beyond recognition. The instructor's podium now belonged to her, and the assembled Marines listened with the attention that comes from knowing they were receiving guidance from someone whose expertise had been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. The compound in Sector 12 represents a tactical challenge that conventional approaches will struggle to overcome, she told the advanced combat training class, pointing to satellite imagery displayed on the large screen. "Success requires integration of infiltration techniques, precision marksmanship, and adaptive tactical thinking that goes beyond standard military doctrine." The Marines taking notes included many of the same recruits who'd trained alongside her 8 months earlier. Rodriguez sat in the front row, her expression showing the professional respect of someone who'd learned to value demonstrated competence over initial impressions. Miller occupied his usual position near the back, but his casual dismissal had been replaced by serious attention to someone whose tactical knowledge he'd learned to trust. The transformation hadn't been immediate or simple. Ember's unauthorized rescue mission had triggered investigations that extended through multiple levels of military and intelligence hierarchies, requiring explanations that tested the boundaries of classified information protocols and operational security requirements. Major Harrison, now seated in the back of the briefing room as an observer rather than her commanding officer, had spent weeks processing the reality that his most underestimated recruit possessed a classified service record that included operations across 3 continents and confirmed eliminations that exceeded the totals of most career special operations personnel. The revelation of her 423 confirmed kills had fundamentally altered not just how Camp Pendleton viewed Ember's capabilities, but how the entire training program approached the assessment of personnel potential and the recognition of non-obvious qualifications. "The mistake most tactical planners make," Ember continued, "is assuming that difficult terrain or unconventional approaches are automatically impossible. In reality, what appears impossible to conventional thinking often represents the optimal solution for someone with appropriate preparation and willingness to operate outside standard parameters." Her teaching methodology drew from years of operational experience that her Students couldn't fully comprehend, but could definitely benefit from learning. The technique she demonstrated had been developed through life-or-death situations where theoretical knowledge met practical application under the highest possible stakes. Colonel Richards, who'd become her primary liaison during the transition from recruit to instructor, observed the class from the briefing room's control area. His role in facilitating her new position had required navigating bureaucratic challenges that reflected the military's struggle to accommodate personnel whose backgrounds didn't fit conventional categories. The integration of intelligence gathering, tactical movement, and precision engagement requires preparation that extends far beyond weapons qualification and physical fitness standards, Ember explained, demonstrating movement techniques that her former fellow recruits now studied with serious attention to detail. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that the person they'd once considered too small and inexperienced for combat operations was now teaching advanced tactical concepts that challenged the thinking of seasoned Marines. Her appointment as senior tactical instructor had required waivers and approvals from authorities who rarely encountered personnel with her unique combination of operational experience and institutional position, but the results spoke for themselves. Marines trained under Ember's instruction demonstrated tactical sophistication and adaptive thinking that exceeded previous program standards. More importantly, they learned to recognize and value capabilities that didn't conform to obvious expectations, creating a cultural shift that extended throughout the training environment. Remember, she concluded the day's instruction, the most dangerous assumption in tactical planning is that you understand all the variables and capabilities present in any given situation. The opponent you underestimate, the terrain you dismiss as impassable, the approach you consider impossible. These often represent exactly the factors that determine mission success or failure. As the class dispersed, Rodriguez approached the podium with a question that reflected the personal journey she'd experienced alongside Ember's professional transformation. "Ma'am, looking back at our training 8 months ago, what should we have recognized about your capabilities that we missed?" Ember considered the question carefully, understanding that her response would influence how these Marines approached assessment of their own personnel in future operations. "The mistake wasn't in failing to recognize my specific capabilities," she replied. "The mistake was in assuming that official qualifications and obvious physical characteristics provided complete information about someone's potential contribution to mission success. The lesson isn't about me, it's about remaining open to possibilities that don't fit standard expectations." The conversation continued as other students joined the discussion, creating the kind of learning environment that Ember had hoped to foster when she first arrived at Camp Pendleton under very different circumstances. That evening, she sat in her new quarters, significantly upgraded from the recruit barracks, reviewing operational reports and preparing lesson plans for advanced classes that pushed the boundaries of conventional tactical instruction. Through her window, she could see new recruit companies conducting their basic training, young Marines beginning their own journeys of professional development and personal discovery. Some of them would exceed expectations in obvious ways, demonstrating natural aptitude for conventional military skills. Others would struggle with standard requirements while possessing hidden capabilities that might prove crucial in unexpected situations. Her role now was ensuring that the institution remained capable of recognizing and developing both types of potential. The transformation from dismissed recruit to respected instructor represented more than personal vindication. It demonstrated that military effectiveness required institutions capable of recognizing excellence regardless of how it was packaged or where it originated. Ember's story had become part of Camp Pendleton's institutional memory, a reminder that the most unlikely people sometimes possessed exactly the capabilities that desperate situations required. The lesson extended beyond her individual experience to broader questions about assessment, opportunity, and the recognition that true strength often came in forms that conventional thinking failed to anticipate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.